So today I am going to introduce Dr. Stephen J. Scanlan, who's going to be talking to us about the global hunger crisis, food poverty, and its complexities in a world of plenty. Dr. Scanlan is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. His research interests include the intersections of poverty and inequality with food hunger and insecurity, gender and development, protest and social change, and environmental justice. He has published numerous articles in venues such as American Sociological Review, International Journal of Comparative Sociology, International Journal of Agriculture and Food, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and World Development, among others, in addition to selections in multiple books, most recently a chapter in Development and Crisis, Threats to Human Well-Being in the Global South and Global North. He teaches social inequality and social change, the sociology of poverty, environmental sociology, and a capstone in environmental justice and inequality, in addition to directing a study abroad program in Ireland, which is called Food Hunger and Inequality, the Great Irish Famine in Contemporary Perspective. Dr. Scanlan also is a member of the Wealth and Poverty theme and teaches the seminar on wealth and poverty, which is offered in spring 2017. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Scanlan. Great.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for coming out today. I promised to have us out of here by the debate, which gives us 5 hours, so we have plenty of time to deal with a very complex, challenging issue, and one that certainly has been around for a while, but also one that merits our attention today and moving forward. I just want to give you a little roadmap as to where we're headed, and then we'll go from there. I want to make sure, point 6, to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion as you have those arise. But if you need clarification along the way, by all means, please let me go. I'll do a bit of an introduction. I then want to get us all on the same page with regard to conceptualizing hunger and food insecurity. Food poverty specifically will be a key element of that dynamic. I'll throw some current data and trends at you. I'll try to keep the numbers to a minimum. I don't want to lull you to sleep with lots of charts and figures and facts and whatnot. However, I will have some of those, and I'll probably bring up some others without me realizing it. So by all means, try to keep myself in check on that front. Then finally, in terms of getting into food poverty and its complexities, kind of the last kind of bit about, well, what is it about hunger, its complexities, how many different ways should we look at things that come into play, things that go beyond maybe what we assume to be, or what we hear, or what we see in the media to be part of the questions. And then I'll give you some suggestions of places you can go to learn more. And then once again, questions and discussion. One other thing, just what this talk is and what it's not. We've probably all heard the phrase, or perhaps heard the phrase, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, as it applies to weddings and getting married and so forth. And that's similarly the case here. Those of you who are well-versed in hunger, famine, food insecurity, you'll probably hear a lot of familiar things that you've come across in your own research, things that you've come across in your own reading, your studies. Hopefully at the same time, though, there'll be some new things, even for those who are well-versed in hunger and food insecurity. For most of you, though, I'm guessing that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is fairly new. So on that front, I want to keep it not so much as a research talk in the sense that, ooh, this is this really narrow finding study that I'm doing. In fact, I'm really borrowing from a lot of work that I've done kind of throughout my career. I'm borrowing from classic work that, again, would be probably familiar to folks that have studied the issue. So in that sense, I'm going to tell you a little about a lot of things as opposed to a lot about a little thing. So we're going for breadth, not depth. And my apologies to those who really wanted depth. But again, I think most of us want breadth, and I'm giving you lots of things to then go out and explore on your own and discover and try to make sense of. By all means, hopefully that will be the case. And then lastly, the old, new, borrowed, blue. Hunger is one of those topics that isn't necessarily one that we are happy about, so to speak. In fact, global challenges this week, a lot of the issues are very heavy, challenging issues that merit a lot of discussion and grappling with. That doesn't mean it has to be depressing and sad, though. By all means, it can be uplifting and hopeful. So at the end, i.e. where to learn more, where can we do more as well potentially. So let's not just leave it as an academic discussion, but carry that discussion on and do a lot of good deeds with your hands and getting your hands dirty and so forth and addressing this type of issue. Okay? Just a couple of things then to kind of lay the foundation. And we'll start with a quotation from Hillel Elver, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And a couple years back, actually 2015, Hillel noted that, quote, for the 2 billion people making less than $2 a day, many of whom live in rural areas where resource-poor farmers cultivate small plots of land, most can't afford to buy food. It is the economic system that is responsible for this prevalence of poverty and hunger. Okay? So we're talking about extreme poverty. We're talking about the 2 billion globally who live in extreme poverty. And when we start to think about hunger, when we start to think about a hunger crisis, especially in a world of plenty, we have to put it in that economic context. We have to start with the ability for people to really buy and acquire and access the food that they need. And that will be a theme throughout. Okay? So as with many of the challenges that we'll talk about this week, whether it's ones on the series of talks this week or other kinds of global issues, the conversation always typically starts with economics, or often starts with economics. And that's the case with hunger as well. Now, we won't leave it at that, but that's often the case. So ways of connecting it to poverty, besides the food poverty-specific kind of construction that we'll do, we can think about it in a number of ways. Okay? One is we could tie or connect poverty or call poverty really one of the most extreme forms of poverty. Hunger as one of the most extreme forms of poverty. It's where individuals or families are so impoverished that they can't afford the most basic of essentials, right? The most basic of needs, the most basic of things that we need for our survival. Okay? It's an extreme form of poverty. More broadly, it's even a kind of this quintessential indicator of inequality. Okay? It's not just about the economic impoverishment, but also other forms of inequality that become important as well, be it gender, cultural, rural, urban differences, these types of things that also come into play. Okay? And because of that complexity, because of these other factors, these inequality dynamics, and the challenges that we have addressing those, it's been quite persistent. And hunger and famine and food insecurity, however we want to talk about these things, has long evaded, a perfect solution or an ideal solution. And then lastly, as I kind of alluded to, it's I think appropriate that this talk be scheduled first in a series of other talks addressing global challenges, because I think, as you'll see with climate change, as you'll see with global health initiatives, as you'll see with HIV, as you'll see with the other things that are in and out of the conversation this whole week, hunger is connected to those things. Food insecurity ties to these dynamics as well. Its talons reach a number of areas that become very important for us to address and discuss. Okay? Well, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? You'll notice that I will slip in and out of talking about hunger or food insecurity, or I may occasionally say food security as the opposite of food insecurity. We'll talk specifically more about food poverty, right? I'm throwing around a lot of terms, okay? So hopefully you can kind of maintain and juggle these in your head to understand them in the way that I intend them to be understood, but also understand them in the way that the research and discussion and policy ends up wanting us to mean, or wants us to use them. Essentially, I'm going to simplify a bit and talk about hunger essentially as being the same thing as food insecurity, which would be the opposite of food security, which we're going to do this brief lesson on. This should all hopefully become clear in a second or two, or a minute or two. Okay, well, we get our main definition, or a lot of our definitions, a lot of our discussion about food security came about in the early 70s, when the World Food Conference of 1974 really started to speak about food self-sufficiency, not of just individuals and families, but also entire countries. And it's that notion of food self-sufficiency, that notion of security that entered the field that we started to think about, not this issue as just hunger, but food insecurity in a more complex fashion. And that complex fashion implied that it was not just about you or I as individuals. It was not just about you and your family, but about more complex, interactive, interdependent types of situations. So food security depended on more than just you or I, right? It depended on a lot of different factors. Probably the most basic, one of the more often cited definitions, I know I cite it probably more, probably in everything that I do, comes from Reutlinger. And Reutlinger is actually writing for the World Bank in '86 when he came up with this definition. But he simply defined food security as access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. That's food security. Now, food insecurity would be lacking this access. It would be the opposite of that, in fact. Again, access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Keep that in mind because the United Nations Development Program builds on that using similar language, but in a rather lengthy definition, giving us a lot more details, a lot more specifics, a lot more factors at work that get into the complexity, the dynamics that I want to emphasize here today. The UNDP then therefore says that food security exists when, quote, all people at all times have both physical and economic access to basic food. This requires not just enough food to go around, it requires that people have ready access to food. That they have a, quote, entitlement to food by growing it for themselves, by buying it, or taking advantage of it in a public food distribution system. Lastly, in this definition, the availability of food is thus a necessary condition of security, but not a sufficient one. That is, people can starve even when enough food is available. Okay? Now, it's important to keep in mind some key elements of this definition. These are going to be things that kind of come in and out of the talk. But you'll notice that both Reutlinger for the World Bank and then UNDP, access by all people at all times. This isn't food security just for the wealthy industrialized nations. This just isn't food security for people who happen to have skin that looks like mine. This just isn't food security for males versus women, you know, middle-aged folks versus kids or adults or whatever. This is all people at all times, right? So this food security for all dynamic that came out of the World Food Summit in '96 was something that we've been working on and trying to nourish and foster for quite a while now. Okay, so food security for all, a key element. But other things. The idea, again, that it's not just about food that's out there. It's also about food that you can actually access. Food that you can either purchase, food that you can acquire through bartering, public distribution systems, these types of things. Because as we know, with this last part, people can starve even when there's enough food is available. The history of famines have shown that. And the current situation of hunger and food insecurity certainly shows that. Okay, taking this a step further then, continuing our brief lesson, we can really take those definitions, pull them apart, think about the current global hunger crisis, how it plays out, and then talk about it in its several forms and components. Okay, first things first. Okay, and this comes from DeRose, Messer, and Millman. They've kind of borrowed and modified other type of similar work from folks, but this is probably, I think they do it in probably the most clear fashion. But they talk about food security and food insecurity as having three dimensions. Okay, the first one being food shortage. That is, it refers to the supply of foodstuffs out there. How much food is available? Okay, how much food is available? This is the classic question of supply, right? Okay, we can't consume food if there's no food available to consume. Okay, supply therefore matters. How much do we produce? How do we process it? Where is it available? These types of things. Okay, now we can't stop there, right? Because again, going back to our definitions, we could have all the food available in the world, but it wouldn't matter if what? Well, it wouldn't matter if you weren't able to purchase it. It wouldn't matter if you were a discriminated ethnic or cultural group that didn't have access to market places, or if there wasn't a public food aid system to distribute that. So therefore, we also have to think about or consider a second dimension, and that's food poverty. And this is kind of the core. This is in the title. This is the emphasis that I think becomes most important in these types of discussions. And that is, food poverty refers to the individual ability to acquire food for consumption. Now, this can be through purchasing it, It can be non-market production. You can grow it yourself, for example, or public assistance, these things that I've mentioned, the things that come out of the UNDP definition. That is, we're talking about access. We're talking about access to food. Again, it doesn't matter how much of this we have. If you can't access it, you're going to go hungry, right? Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward. And this becomes the key idea. Now, food poverty, let me clarify a bit. We often think about poverty in the forms of economic, like how much money do you have in your pockets, right? Well, there's other forms of poverty. There are many poverties that exist. Food poverty, health poverty, educational poverty, information poverty. It's a way of talking about the lack of something important and basic and needed for human survival, for human achievement, for human capabilities. Food is certainly one of those. So food poverty gets in the way of human potential. It denies our capabilities. Okay, so that's the concept. So yeah, it certainly ties to economics, but it's much more than that. Okay, lastly, DeRose, Messer, and Millman also give us a third element, and that's food deprivation. Okay, food deprivation. This is the physical use of the food derived from human consumption. Okay, it relates to nutrition. It relates to balance, the diet that we have, the food that we consume, and how that provides a healthy lifestyle. Or on the flip side, are we chronically undernourished? Do we have poor health associated with vitamin and mineral deficiencies? Okay? Yes, we need food available. Yes, we need to have that food accessible. But yes, that food should also nourish our bodies, right? It should nourish our bodies. So in times of famine, the North Korean famine, for example, folks would consume things that weren't nutritionally viable. Tree bark, dirt, things of that nature, which might fill a stomach, might make one feel less, quote unquote, hungry, but certainly no more food insecure in the sense that it wasn't providing any kind of sustenance, any kind of value, and so forth. Okay? Now, as if 3 components weren't enough, I want to throw in a couple others, right? Again, I'm going to fill your heads today. We're getting all kinds of ideas that we're going to explore. But we should also throw in factors such as food stability as an element of food insecurity and hunger. And that is the ability to withstand various shocks, as well as food sovereignty. And this is the empowerment one has over the choice of food that one consumes, where it comes from, and so forth. And just a couple comments and points on these. Okay, these two are tied closely to poverty and inequality. These two are tied very closely to the elements and components that Messer and all, that Millman and all give us, DeRose, Millman, and Messer give us. Okay, so for example, when we had the global food crisis, 2007, 2008, a global spike in pricing worldwide, that's an important shock. And there might be plenty of food available, you might be able to even afford it, and it might even be nutritionally valuable. But if the shock of a large increase in prices prevents you from acquiring it, and you can't withstand that shock, right, you're going to experience food insecurity. So by basis of comparison, roughly in the United States, probably we pay maybe 1/5, 1/6, even 1/7, depending on the estimate of our income, of our earnings towards food. It used to be 1/3, and it's been reduced a lot in the last 50 years. In some places around the world, people may use half, 2/3, 3/4 of their income to purchase food. So imagine you're standing in water, the analogy goes, right, up to your chin, okay, and you only have so much room to play with. Well, when those food prices go up, it doesn't take much for you to be underwater, okay? So those types of shocks become important. We could also talk about humanitarian crises, refugee crises. We could talk about conflict, natural disasters, anything of that nature, okay? Also on this front, with regard to sovereignty, we bring in some cultural considerations, right? Cultural elements with regard to nutrition and values and the historical meaning of food. And again, you might not have food available, you might not be able to afford it, but through systems of international food aid, it becomes available. But if it's culturally inappropriate, or if it's something you don't know what to do with, or how to prepare, then therefore food sovereignty becomes even more of a question as well. So you want to make sure that that's the case. Okay, so just the last couple points in terms of our brief lesson. For the world's hungry, food insecurity is really about not knowing where your next meal is coming from, okay? Point blank, not knowing where your next meal is coming from, not having any long-term vision of that. And again, this isn't just about growing food, agriculture. It's not just about economics, but as we'll see, there are a lot of cultural, environmental, political, social, population, other kinds of considerations that we need to put into the mix, okay? So here's the numbers part, and again, I'll keep this somewhat to a minimum. Where are we? Where do we stand? This is actually something I update from a paper that I did a few years ago that I continue to use in class. But it conveniently starts in 1996 with the World Food Summit in 96, again, declaring food security for all, and gets us up to the most recent version of what is called the State of Food Insecurity in the World, which is an annual publication that the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization puts out. The reason why some of these dates are circa 2013, 14, 15, and so forth is they've used 3-year averages to get some of these terms. So that's typically the middle year. So where are we in terms of numbers? Well, this is the total number of the world's population experiencing hunger from 96 to really the present. These are the most recent data. And so we can go back to 96, and we can see, and these are in millions. So this is 834 million, add 6 zeros. Okay, decline, decline, increase, 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 spike. Right? World food crisis, global food crisis. Okay, and then a steady decline since then to where now, for the first time these last couple years, we've actually dipped below the 800 million people mark. Okay, now raw numbers are one thing, percentages are another, and actually the percentages even tell a more optimistic, a better story, right? Because as hunger numbers have declined, where population keeps growing, right? Right? Population hasn't stopped, hunger numbers going down, that means the percentage is going to go down at even a bigger tick. So we could go back then, 96, 14.4%, okay, decline, decline, climb, drop, peak, to where we're at about 11% now of the world's population. 11%. Roughly, a little less than 1 in 10. Okay? That's good news, okay? That's a positive trend. That's a trend that we want to see continue. Okay? Now, in terms of global food crisis, that's important to keep in mind. Having said that, however, it's still nearly 800 million people, right, going to bed each night. Food insecure. That's 800 people, 25, 30% of whom are kids, going to bed hungry each night. That's 800 million people, 95, 96, potentially as high as 97 or 8% living in less industrialized, impoverished countries, right? Yes, downward trend, good. 11%, okay, right? But this has to keep going, right? That's the food crisis. That's the 800 million people that are out there. We're speaking globally, but we could do locally as well. But so keep that in mind, okay? As we move forward. Just a few other things. This is more for your reference, and I refer you to it to kind of follow up for. But also every year, the World Food Program does its hunger map. So this is the 2015 version. And they have it broken down, and I don't expect that you can see this in the back, but some very low to very high food insecurity. So the medium colored orange is actually moderately high, red high, very high. And so you can see that most of the world has very low, pretty much the Western Hemisphere, with the exception of some of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, such as Haiti and Bolivia, a couple countries in Latin or Central America. For the most part, very low food insecurity, right? Concentrations of South and Southeast Asia in the middle range, Sub-Saharan Africa in the middle and more severe range and whatnot. This map is actually interactive if you go online, so you could just Google like World Food Program hunger map, and you can play with that. Okay, pulling out some of those things. Where do we see the regional variation? This is undernourished population. This is a percentage of a population that's actually undernourished, not just kids, not just elderly, but the entire population. And we see variation across regions of the world. Now, albeit these regions have a lot of diversity within them. These are averages across there. But for the most part, as benchmarks, as for convenience. We can see a couple of things. Okay, South Asia, if we're looking at raw numbers, has the highest number of undernourished individuals. And these are South Asia, we're talking primarily Bangladesh and India here. Okay? India has more poor people than we have people in the United States, so it's not surprising that there would also be, a large number of hungry, undernourished individuals in South Asia. But in terms of percentages, in terms of the population, the region of the world with the highest percentage of individuals, we're talking sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and this is 2015, and a little over 23%. Okay, not quite 1 in 4, but still very large. And then we're also talking about 220 million. So take these two together, and you really are looking at 500 million, looking at over half of the world's hungry that we've talked about, this 795 million in those two regions of the world. Taking this a step further, we can look at what are called low-income food deficit countries. Low-income food deficit countries. And low-income food deficit countries, or LIFDCs, the FAO constructs this list every year. And does so in a way that emphasizes the fact that there are a couple of things going on. There's a food access problem, and there's an income poverty dynamic to that. Okay, so countries throughout the world that are poor economically, but are also experiencing other forms of strife, become very important to consider and make this list. And kind of building off the map, we shouldn't be surprised that there's a concentration of these in Africa and then Asia, but very few in the Americas or the South Pacific. And so we can see these countries as being kind of our chronic food insecurity countries, kind of our most at-risk countries. Now, we could speak generally about that, which I'm kind of doing today, or we could take each individual country and each sub-region within these countries and tell many, many, many different stories about the struggles and the challenges and dynamics of food insecurity. Okay? So again, I'm speaking big and broad here, but it's up to us to take those broad themes and see how they fit with these other kinds of stories and tales and so forth. Okay? All right, well, let's get to some of these other challenges. Let's get to some of the more specific types of dynamics and things going on. And in doing this, and in studying hunger and studying food insecurity and studying food poverty, we really want to look at multiple dynamics, right? We want to understand what makes people or puts people at risk, what makes them more vulnerable. At the same time, we want to see who is most at risk in the global food crisis. How or why are certain segments of the world's population or segments of populations within countries, why or how are they more vulnerable and so forth. Okay? Well, as I alluded to earlier, we got to consider a number of challenges, a number of forms of inequality, and we really have to put this in a kind of political economy of the world food system context. Okay? A political economy dominated by agribusiness, a political economy dominated by industrial agriculture. So what goes on in even the teeniest and tiniest of marketplaces around the globe really can't be separated from what goes on in terms of the boardrooms of some of the largest agribusiness companies. So farmers producing in Iowa, row after row after row of corn, and feedlots in West Texas and Oklahoma that produce, cattle by the ton and ton and ton. That's inseparable again from the banana plantations in Central America to the rice growing operations in Southeast Asia and so forth and so forth. It's all interconnected. Okay, that implicates us. That implicates consumers. That implicates governments. That we're all involved in this dynamic. Okay, so what are some of these complexities? Well, right. I mean, these are big things. These are big things. And these are enormous types of questions to consider when it comes then to understanding a global food crisis that goes beyond just the economics of it, that goes beyond just the production dynamics of it, that really gets at the challenges that food access poses on people's ability to meet, again, this most basic of needs. Okay? Now, I have these in alphabetical order, just out of convenience. I don't know that There are probably some that are more pressing, others that are, still important, but maybe not as pressing or don't get as much attention. But all of them taken together present a really complex challenge to really address food insecurity, but also to understand it in all of its glory, so to speak. I won't say too much about climate change. Tomorrow's talk at 10:30 is about climate change. But we do have to at least acknowledge the fact that we are living in an era of increased global warming, of climate change and climate impacts that become important. Why is that important for food? Well, if we're talking about food availability as that first component, right, that's step one. If we don't have that, these other things, don't matter anyway. Well, there's nothing more impactful, right, on food availability than climate. So drought, extreme weather conditions, right? El Nino, La Nina, all these types of things. Yeah, we could talk about growing stuff in new places, right? Yay, it's warmer, I still have tomato blossoms on my plants, right? I'm still growing tomatoes into October. Hooray, right? Well, no, because that means where you're supposed to grow tomatoes and corn, it's hotter and the season becomes more insufferable, right? Okay? Or what happens to fish stocks? What happened with oceans becoming more acidified? And again, let alone the storms and so forth and so on, right? So we have to think about that. We have to throw that dynamic in. We have to look at, I'm simplifying, but we have to look at why that matters, okay? Secondly, conflict, war, the quote-unquote military famine, extremely important. Turn on the news. We see aid convoys being blocked to reach people in, refugees, and certainly Aleppo. We see Boko Haram blocking access in Nigeria. We see this type of thing throughout history, right? It's not just a current problem, but throughout history. The blockade has been a weapon. We see food as a weapon of war, okay? Denying your enemy sustenance, right? Destroying fields, poisoning wells, these types of things, okay? And the modern world is no exception, and we haven't gotten beyond that. So any civil war that takes place, anytime we put mines in fields where farmers typically grow food, we're going to have military famine experiences. We're going to have these types of things get in the way. So if we were to go back and look at some of the low-income food deficit nations, we'd see countries like Afghanistan on that list. We'd see countries like the Sudan on that list, and South Sudan. We would see in Ethiopia, we would see countries prone to or currently involved in civil unrest. Okay? I mentioned before, in terms of forms of inequality of all types, gender inequality, enormously important. Enormously important. The flip side, empowering women, right? Empowering women, including them in the economy, educating them, giving them a voice, has extremely strong impacts on the well-being, the health well-being, the food well-being of kids, of families, of whole societies throughout the planet, right? When you deny women who, for the most part, do most of the agricultural work, the large majority of agricultural work in a lot of countries around the world, when you incorporate them into decision-making processes, the benefits are several times over and important. Okay, governance, human rights, and food. The classic adage that no stable democracy has ever experienced a famine. From Amartya Sen's development is freedom. That notion, that idea that food is most basic. It's a human right. It cannot be denied. It should not be denied. Becomes extremely important. So autocracy versus democracy and human rights versus human oppression becomes an important consideration. Okay. Land grabs, this kind of new form of imperialism. Multinational corporations, companies purchasing or leasing land in new places around the world. Okay, often without discussion from local communities, often without them knowing that it's happening in the first place until they get removed from the land. Okay, extremely, extremely important. Why? Well, they might be using it for agricultural purposes, in fact, predominantly used for agricultural purposes. But it's typically for export crops. It's typically taking and growing food in this place, this land that they acquire, this foreign investment that they acquire, and exporting it elsewhere to profit as opposed to feeding folks. Okay? Certainly the politics of food, misdirected aid, extremely controversial, extremely difficult area. Emergency aid is great. Emergency aid saves a lot of lives. Emergency aid, when applied and able to reach those in need, works in terms of crises intervention. So if we have a refugee camp and we can reach those refugees with appropriate food, nutrition, health, these types of things dramatically improve. Programmatic aid, however, can be problematic. That is the regular type of food aid that is doled out. It can disrupt local economies. It can disrupt local pricing. It's often distributed to not necessarily folks who need it the most, but distributed instead to friends in the global, of U.S. interest or of interest to other entities, the EU or OPEC or whoever might be giving the aid out. Furthermore, aid that's in cash, far more desirable than aid that's in food. Oxfam will tell you that if you want to help us out, write us a check. We'll use that check to buy food that supports the local farmer in the local marketplace. They selling what he or she produced there, boosting their markets, putting money in their pocket, as opposed to exporting extra grain from the United States that is either credited to them or that they paid money for, when in reality there's plenty in local economies and so forth that could benefit from that. Last couple, racial, ethnic, cultural inequalities. Again, the food sovereignty question becomes important. The way we treat refugees around the world. Certainly questions of biopiracy, indigenous culture, indigenous rights, and what do things like globalization, free trade, how does that impact on their livelihoods? How does that impact on their ability to do things that they've been doing for centuries? To use Oxfam as another example, Mexican farmers being shut out of being able to sell corn in the marketplace. Something they've been doing for centuries, something they've developed, in fact, but yet can't do so because of free trade agreements that have shut out this extremely important cultural thing. And then rural livelihoods, the struggle of farmers, we see that here, we see it elsewhere. We see vulnerability, in terms of people who are ironically producing the world's food, yet struggling. Okay? Well, what haven't I mentioned? Well, population and population pressure often becomes the focus. And in fact, often we default to that. Often when it comes to hunger, we start with that. This argument, this classic neo-Malthusian argument that there are just simply too many mouths to feed. Okay? Projections now are looking at almost 10 billion people by 2050. Some will argue that we have to double, maybe even triple food production by that time to make that work. Okay? Well, we can't just dismiss population arguments. These are indeed important. I don't want to underestimate them, especially with regard to their environmental challenges, the political and social challenges that they create. However, we can't simplify the issue of hunger and the global hunger crisis to just that. We have to go beyond assuming that population pressure is the only thing going on. That brings us back then to these questions of access. That brings us back to the questions of inequality. It brings us back to the fact that we need to really get beyond what I and some colleagues have called a scarcity fallacy. We need to get beyond what Francis Moore Lappé has called the scarcity scare. There's too many other things going on. And so it's not just about population. And in fact, it's about consumption. And so in this world of plenty dynamic, we know that food is plentifully available. We have far more calories today than we've ever had, far more calories than we even need to consume. So the global average, this is 2013 data, 2,870 calories per capita. In the United States in 2013, it was over 3,600 calories. Far, far more than we need, far above the minimum. We can live a healthy lifestyle with 2,000, 2,200 calories, depending on what that is. So therefore, again, we have to look at the access. We have to look at the distribution. Okay? We need to ask ourselves, what happens to the food we produce? What kind of diets and food production dynamics are sustainable? Why is it, again, that hundreds of millions that remain hungry despite growth in production and distribution? Okay? I'll come back to that, maybe, with time. So let's look at some of the challenges that exist. What else happens to the food? How is it consumed in other ways than you or I eating it? How is it consumed in other ways that's going to help people in terms of meeting their nutritional needs, right? That utilization dynamic. Well, livestock diversion, biofuel diversion, and food waste become extremely important in this equation. We have to add that into the mix with regard to food insecurity and its complexities. We have to add that into the mix of why people still go hungry. Why is there a food crisis in a world of plenty? So livestock diversion, the amount of grain consumed, 70% of the U.S. production of grain, by some estimates, is consumed by livestock. Satisfy meat-based diets. A study, it's been a while ago, it's been about 10 years ago now, but a Cornell study, a classic study, found that we could feed 800 million people with just that livestock grain, right? Now, this is simplified just a little bit, but imagine that, okay? Imagine that. Biofuel diversion, another one. The Earth Policy Institute, I've seen this story cited and quoted in so many different ways, but I'll do it myself because I think it's such a telling one. That the amount of grain needed, the amount of grain needed to fill the tank of an SUV in the United States with ethanol just once could feed a person for a year. In total, you could eliminate 330 million people from a life of hunger, taking these kinds of things into consideration. And then waste becomes extremely important as well. The FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, reports that roughly 1/3 of the food produced in the world for human consumption every year. That's human consumption, not animal or otherwise, human consumption. Approximately 1.3 billion tons gets lost or wasted, okay? Adding on to that, if just 23%, less than 1/4 of that food, if less than 1/4 of that could be saved or get to where it's needed, we could feed the 790 million hungry people in the world, okay? So there's pizza back there. I don't want to see a damn bit of it go to it. One swear word. I'm allowed one swear word for talk. Anyway, these seem simple, right? These seem like kind of no-brainer types of dynamics. But when we factor in political economy, right? When we factor in culture, when we factor in diet, I mentioned this. I'll go back to this chart with regard to global meat consumption that's growing, right? 2011, U.S. we ate 432 calories of meat per day. China, it's 453. This is growing as more countries develop and have wealth to buy protein of this fashion. It's going to be growing and growing. So what's going to happen then as these diets evolve and change to be more Western? Well, that potentially could be more for the livestock. That could potentially be more for divert fields for growing feedstock and so forth instead of fields for human consumption. Okay? So we have to think about that. We have to factor in our choices, our cultural choices, our individual choices when it comes to the food we consume. Okay, so let's pull it all together, and then that way we'll have some 10 or 15 minutes for conversation. Again, food poverty, the global hunger crisis, many complexities examined here. It really comes down to what scholars now are working on in the area of food justice. Food justice and really what amounts to the fairness and equity in the global food system. If you want a definition, Gottlieb and Yoshi provide a really good one that I like. And they describe food justice as, in quote, ensuring that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported, and distributed and accessed are eaten and shared, are shared fairly. Okay, food justice, that rights dynamic, that equity dynamic, that we would assume would be first and foremost in a lot of our conversation, but seems to slip through the crack. Food justice calls for revolutionary transformation of the world food system to address each of food security's components, as well as the multiple factors that we've been talking about. So not only is food justice important to getting food in our bodies, but food justice is important to peace that ends the Civil War. Food justice is important to ensuring gender equity. Food justice, that's important to the dignity of refugees and making sure that they are addressed and taken care of in their times of need and so forth. Okay? Connecting to food sovereignty dynamics, specifically with regard to those components. Some of you may have heard Philip McMichael's talk a couple years, or last year, I guess it was, talking about, and one of the particularly important quote is that the discussion of rights has to shift away from the right to purchase food to guaranteeing the right to food, okay? The right to guaranteeing the right to food, not just the right to purchase food for the global citizenry. This latter idea emphasizes basic human needs. It emphasizes how powerlessness, poverty, and inequality gets in the way and imposes on food security. Okay? So food poverty and food injustice in a world of plenty must be of concern to all, not just those who are most vulnerable, but everyone, because we all have a role in the crisis. Okay? Final thought. In 2012, the United Nations World Food Program proclaimed hunger to be, quote, the world's greatest solvable problem. Okay? This is Global Challenges Week. The WFP is calling it the world's greatest solvable problem. Okay? Only we have the power to show that this is the case. Okay? It's up to us. And if we want the change to happen, then therefore we have to be a part of that. Okay? Where can we learn more? This is just the tip of the iceberg, right? You could look at any number of government agencies, the FAO, UNICEF, the World Food Program, USAID, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Okay, again, there's controversy associated with some of those organizations, and give or take. So therefore, you should also look at some non-governmental organizations, various research institutes that are active globally. Again, these are just a few of the many. Closer to home, get involved with rural action, get involved with community food initiatives, get involved with Live Healthy Appalachia or the Food Matters Club here on campus. Support your local food pantry, these types of things. It starts at home, and it's in starting at home that the bigger dynamics can be addressed and taken care of. So with that, again, plenty of time before the debate. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, and any questions or clarifications or comments or insights that you can share with colleagues here to continue the dialogue, so to speak. Thank you very much. And I have a microphone up here, so if you have a question, I'll repeat it. So that, okay. Questions? Keep walking to that line. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, are you familiar with The Economist's Tale, by chance?
The Economist's Tale.
It's a book written by, where was he? He was from, I want to say the FAO, working in Sierra Leone, and he writes a story about...
Okay, please share.
Yeah, he writes a story about how working there, and he's supposed to do food policy research and figure out, how much it is saved, and kind of figure out, what's the situation like there. It's a basic overview. And towards the end, the World Bank actually is the World Bank and the IMF is about to institute a policy on the government where all of the rice is going to be completely privatized. And they do very little research into it, but through his research, he finds out that this is going to cause, a half-decade-long famine. And the World Bank and IMF are completely unaware of this, and his story is kind of to bring this to their attention and, go against the Goliath and tell them, that they are wrong and that they shouldn't be doing this. So, and you kind of talked about the misdirection of aid and the kind of different politics of food aid. But I was wondering, so where do those World Bank, IMF kind of misconceptions and lack of, contextual understanding come from? And I say this with the international development background, so where does that come from, and what can really be done to get a better sense of local context rather than these top-down structural programs?
I mean that's really the core. When it comes back to the notion of food justice and food sovereignty, as these are really, I'm calling these kind of components of food security and ways of thinking about it. But these are actually food movements. There's a food justice movement. La Via Campesina, if you go to the website, you'll see that's kind of the premier type of food movement. And the primary dynamic or challenge or purpose behind all of these is the very thing you're talking about. That is local peasants, local farmers, local communities, indigenous cultures. They've been doing this for centuries. They've been living the life that they've had for years. They've been growing, and yeah, they've experienced famine, and yeah, they're in struggle, and yeah, they are, quote unquote, impoverished by Western standards. are pushing for a bottom-up approach. That is a place at the table. I mean, the whole reason behind a Chiapas rebellion is to say, wait a minute, this NAFTA isn't working for us. It's working for a global political economy in which, again, grain is mass-produced and it's sold to us as opposed to being collaboratively produced within and these types of things. So where do these ideas come from? Well, we are in that mindset that more, bigger, faster, quicker, mass-produced is better, right? And in fact, why do we have more food calories available per day than ever? Well, a part of that is the fact that we have industrialized agriculture. Now, the flip side, though, is that those at a local or even regional model will say, well, and studies have shown this, we can do it as efficiently. In fact, we can do it even better if permitted to do so. If that our markets aren't, if we're not pushed out of our own markets, right? If we have assistance that's technological but not overbearing, that in terms of things like irrigation, for example, does it culturally. It doesn't build a 6-mile wide dam. It doesn't, these careful, smaller, micromanaged kinds of things. And it's also about the capital. And we're not talking loans that are, buying enormous amounts of equipment and huge tracts of land. But there's a story on NPR, I don't know, maybe some of you heard a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember where, but it was about risk and being able to manage risk. And just this simple, it was a Shankar Vedanta, actually, Hidden Brain segment. And it was like there were farmers who would only spend half of what they had because they couldn't risk spending everything, because if there was a famine, they would lose everything. But if they could just have a simple thing like crop insurance, very cheap, accessible crop insurance, that was a foreign concept, right? They would buy into that. They could spend and invest more, produce more. Local economy benefited from that. So simple little things like that, that bottom up, here's what we need, top down, here's how we can work with you on, as opposed to say, just give us your land, we'll grow far, far more food than you could ever imagine, and then you go over here to work, and it's this, I don't know, one of my favorite words, de-peasantification, right? What's that mean? Removing people from the land that they've been working on for years, okay? Hopefully put them in some kind of other occupation so that they can therefore buy the food on the global marketplace that ends up not either being culturally significant or affordable to begin with. I mean, urban slums, we think urban slums, largely a lot of rural folks move to urban slums because life in the rural landscape is too difficult. They can't live off the land anymore. So I don't know if I actually answered the question or dance around it, but I would love, if you have a link, or I'd love to hear that, read more about that as well. Yeah, there's a whole, we just barely scratched the surface of those types of things today. Other questions or other things you can enlighten each other on or me on, other kinds of challenges or issues. Yes, please.
So thank you for the wonderful talk. I like that you covered a whole variety of things.
Okay, good. And this is coming from somebody who knows a lot about food. So good. Or the environment and all kinds of things.
So just kind of to add to his comment, but also kind of to try and throw in a comment that appreciates the depth, kind of like thinking about complexity a little bit more, is this the idea of meat production and eating meat and all the grain that's used on meat and all that statistics, all those kinds of statistics that say we could feed this many more people. That's really valid for livestock production in the US. But if you look at, for example, I was looking at, because I'm from Kenya, obviously, anytime you showed a global map, I was looking at Kenya. But when you look at sub-Saharan African countries, Kenya, for instance, it's only on 20% of the land that you can do grain-fed farming. 80%, actually maybe less than that, is too dry for that. And the country does not have a whole lot of money to do irrigated agriculture. There's some irrigated agriculture, but not a lot. And pastoralism, beef production, which is done by pastoralism, becomes the only way that you can really use the semi-arid landscape that's mostly grasses and that kind of thing. It's a different kind of livestock production, but it becomes really the only way to get protein from that part of the country in a country that protein deficiency is actually an issue.
A big issue.
So so I always like to distinguish that yes, when you're growing, when you're feeding livestock grain, then it's really problematic. But in much of the world where the livestock is eating grass that humans cannot eat, well they can, but it's like eating bark, I guess.
Yeah.
Then it's really important to think about livestock production. Now you throw in climate change into all of that, and what you're actually seeing is the places where pastures, where livestock, where livestock production is going to be the viable food production strategy. Those are actually expanding. So I normally, from a sub-Saharan perspective, I usually argue for recognizing pastoralist and pastoralist production and livestock production, and I'm sure you agree with me, but I just wanted to throw that in just because I know Africa is not usually well known about by the,
I appreciate the comment. Yeah, definitely that's the case. In fact, that's one of those cultural dynamics that a top-down approach would often, if we say, oh no, let's eliminate all of the production of that type, then yeah, certainly that's a historical, cultural dynamic that would get in the way. And one of the things, one of the organizations that came to mind when you're talking, I don't have it up here, but Heifer International, some of you may have heard of, is an organization that actually works in that area. We'll buy an oxen for a community. We'll, cattle for work. We'll, buy you a flock of chickens or ducks, these types of things in terms of from a marketing perspective, that something culturally appropriate, something that fits in with your community in a way that again, that has been going on for centuries in terms of production and consumption of food and markets and these types of things. Good, thank you for that. Good, oh yes, please.
So, as you said, we just barely scratched the surface.
Yes.
And like all these NGOs, there's so many more, and like everyone's been working towards this solution forever, yet we have not reached that. And is the solution genuinely just strategic allocation of resources? Do you think there is a solution?
Yeah, I think we're moving in a way where we're realizing that a lot of these questions that are big, a lot of the ways that we've been doing things since the post-World War II era, more, bigger, faster, better, have not just from a climate change or from an industrialization, globalization point of view, have gotten us to a point where we're realizing we've maybe overstepped or overreached. So if in the United States we can talk about regionalism and local food and these types of economies, certainly globally we can as well, because that's the way it was. Now, what does that do? It's certainly not a magic wand poof, but a shifting, a changing, a reconsideration of the food miles, how far food travels, the oil consumption that goes into the oil we eat, so to speak, and these types of things. Yeah, that's a step in the right direction, I think, in terms of the way we produce and market and share and consume the food. But ultimately, it really does come down, on top of that, just the economics, the inequality, the poverty, these types of things. Until we learn how to not discriminate against women and people who are different, quote unquote, different from us, until we learn how to create viable economies. And that might be a viable food economy, but it might be other types of skills-based, culturally important kinds of contributions in terms of production and education. And so, I mean, yeah, it's complex. We're scratching the surface, but I like where we're headed, and I think the reality check of climate change and population and these kinds of combinations will hopefully, I don't know if we'll ever get the jolt, but get close to the jolt, maybe that a lot of people are on board to try to do. A lot of times we're just trying to catch up with crises as opposed to being able to say, okay, the crises are done. Let's move forward with real policy that actually gets at it. So we're juggling a lot of things. Yeah, thanks.
That's genetically modified organisms as well as crossbreeding with different types of plants and mass producing animals. Do you think that's beneficial to fighting hunger?
Time's up. Can we? No. The GMO question. Okay, let me. I knew it was coming. Oh gosh. Here's my take on GMOs. Okay. okay, and I'm going to probably upset some folks, and I'm going to make other people happy, and my apologies on both ways. But here's what I think. There are, I think, you see, and you can even see I'm wavering because I can't believe I say this sometimes. I believe there are effective uses of technology and science that can be applied to the way we grow and produce food that are effective and that we fully know the implications of, that I think can be beneficial. Now, having said that, I think there's a key: fully know the implications of, and the Frankenfood dynamic and notion of GMO, I think is more frightening than hopeful to me. But I think there are some breakthroughs that I think can be valuable. Now, do we need chickens that have breasts that are so big they can't walk? And do we need to really pump cattle with hormones? And no, there's a line. Just like any science and technology, there's a line. And I think most of us would probably see that line. Some of us would be willing to go further. Some of us don't want to even come close to that line. But this is an ethical question. It's an economic question. It's a cultural question. It's certainly political. And I think it's something, to get back to the last question, it's something we need to figure out what we're willing to tolerate and how much risk we're willing to forego to quote, feed the world. Because at this point, I think we've probably gone past what we would consider tolerable and comfortable with. So there's this whole notion of like attacks on science now, right? We attack evolution, we attack climate change, we attack GMO, we attack, these types of things. And it's funny, all of them I agree, like, oh yeah, we should be skeptical. But the GMO one, I'm like, oh, well, maybe there are some kinds of, but we all need to read more. So nobody walked out, or at least only a couple people walked out. So I guess but no, that's a question I really struggle with. I really do, and I'm not pro-GMO, but I'm definitely not anti 100% all GMOs are bad. Okay, so Teresa Moran's not here, right? So I can say that. Okay, good. Don't tell Teresa. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. She knows that. Okay, other questions that I can help with? Anything? Oh, nope. That's nice. Okay, well, I'm in Bentley Annex 125, sociology. If you have any questions or follow-up, by all means. I'll happily share these slides with you, or I know you can't obviously write down all these, the websites and things like that. So if you have anything that you need from me, feel free to stop by or drop me an email, scanlans@ohio.edu. Thank you very much.